The call came in at 0:30, and Sergeant Major Bryce Hollander was already bleeding out before the helicopter touched down. Mia Sutton heard the rotors before she saw the lights. She was standing in the break room of Eastfield Regional Medical Center, her third cup of bad coffee going cold in her hand, when the trauma bay doors blew open, and the night shifted into something else entirely. She wasn't supposed to be there, not on that floor, not on that shift. She was a hospitalist. Internal medicine, third floor, the quiet ward where patients recovered slowly and nobody screamed. She covered nights when Dr. Ellison called in sick, which he did with increasing frequency lately, and tonight was one of those nights. The ER attending was Dr. Preston Gage, a man who had made it abundantly clear in their 2 years of overlap that he considered hospitalists glorified note-takers. She set down her coffee and walked toward the sound. The man on the gurney was enormous, 6'3", maybe 240, and soaked through his uniform. The medics were shouting over each other. Blunt abdominal trauma, BP dropping, possible splenic lac. She caught the words and started moving faster without deciding to. "Who's the attending?" she asked one of the nurses, a woman named Peg, who had been at Eastfield for 20 years and trusted exactly 4 doctors in the building. Gage called in. Peg didn't look up from the IV line she was threading. "Backup's Dr. Cho, but he's stuck on the highway. 20 minutes out, minimum." Mia looked at the monitor. Heart rate 118. Blood pressure 84/52 and still sliding. 20 minutes was a death sentence. She pulled on a pair of gloves. She had taken exactly 2 steps toward the bay when the doors opened again and the room changed temperature. He was a big man, not as tall as the patient, but carrying himself like he owned every inch of vertical space available. Dress uniform, immaculate. 3 stars on his shoulder. His name tag read Whitaker. She didn't know his first name then. Nobody introduced themselves in that moment. Behind him came 2 more uniformed officers and a man in a dark suit who was already on his phone. Lieutenant General Whitaker scanned the trauma bay with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to assessing damage and assigning blame simultaneously. His eyes moved over the nurses, over the monitors, over the man bleeding on the table, and then they landed on Mia. She was wearing blue scrubs. Her hair was pulled back with a rubber band she'd found in her coat pocket. She was well aware, like someone who organized supply closets for a living. "Where's the trauma surgeon?" Whitaker's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. Peg said, which was Peg's way of saying everything useful without committing to specifics. "Get me the chief of surgery. Dr. Alderman is in the OR. Cardiac case, he cannot be pulled." Whitaker looked at the man in the suit. The man in the suit looked at his phone. Neither of them looked at Mia. "Then get me whoever's next on that list," Whitaker said. "Because that man on that table is Sergeant Major Bryce Hollander, and he has served this country for 22 years, and he is not going to die in a community hospital waiting for someone to find a doctor." The room was quiet for 3 seconds. Then Mia said, "His spleen is lacerating. He needs a splenectomy and probably a hepatic repair. His pressure is 82 and dropping, which means we have a window of maybe 8 minutes before we lose that window entirely. So I need everyone who is not actively helping to step back, and I need someone to call OR2 and tell them to prep." Whitaker turned to look at her fully for the first time. "And you are?" "Dr. Mia Sutton. I'm covering tonight. What is your specialty?" It was not a question. It was a test. "Internal medicine," she said. "But that's not what matters right now." He stared at her. She held it. The monitor beeped, 79/48. "Get me a real surgeon," Whitaker said, and turned away from her. Peg looked at Mia. Mia looked at the monitor. She had expected this. She had not expected to feel quite so calm about it. "General," she said, and something in the way she said it made him stop. Not the word. People said general to him 40 times a day. It was the tone. Flat. Certain. Like someone reading coordinates off a map. "I'm going to ask you one more time to step back. Not because I need permission. Because your presence is a distraction in a space where distraction costs lives." The man in the suit lowered his phone. One of the uniformed officers shifted his weight. Whitaker turned back around slowly. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes," Mia said. "And I know what your rank means and what it doesn't mean in this room. In this room, I'm the ranking officer. She was already moving. Peg, push 2 units o neg. Get me a crash cart standing by. Someone call OR 2, now. She didn't wait to see if Whitaker moved. She heard Peg's voice behind her, calm and practiced, relaying orders. She heard the man in the suit say something low and urgent to the general. She heard Whitaker's exhale, one long, controlled breath, and then the sound of him taking a step back. She had already stopped listening. She was looking at Bryce Hollander's face, which was gray and wet and still. "Stay with me," she said quietly. Not a plea, an order. "You've been in worse spots than this." She didn't know that. She was guessing. But she'd learned a long time ago that what you say to a person in crisis matters as much as what you do with your hands, and she had things to do with her hands. She had been 9 years old when her father came home from Desert Storm. She remembered very specifically that he smelled like dust and something else she didn't have a word for yet, and that he sat at the kitchen table for 3 days without saying much. Her mother brought him coffee. Mia brought him drawings she'd made at school. He'd looked at them with the kind of careful attention that told her he wasn't really seeing them. He died of a heart attack when Mia was 14. Not in the field, in the driveway. That was the first time she'd learned what it felt like next to someone to be helpless, she loved. And she had spent the subsequent 20 years making sure she would never feel it again. She went to college on a ROTC scholarship, put in 4 years as a combat medic before med school. 2 of them in forward operating bases in places that didn't make the news. She'd worked with surgeons who operated by flashlight. She'd improvised arterial clamps from equipment that had no business being used for arterial clamps. She'd held things together, literally and otherwise, until someone better trained arrived, and sometimes someone better trained didn't arrive. And she'd had to make peace with the gap between what she knew and what she needed to know. After her discharge, she went to medical school, then residency, then a fellowship she'd quit halfway through for reasons she didn't discuss. She landed at Eastfield 3 years ago and had been there since, filling in the quiet spaces, doing the work no one else wanted to do. She had never told anyone here about the FOBSs. She saw no reason to. It was not relevant, she thought, to her job ordering lipid panels and adjusting blood pressure medications. She had not anticipated tonight. OR 2 smelled like every OR she'd ever been in, antiseptic and recycled air, and underneath it, the specific metallic warmth of controlled emergency. The anesthesiologist was Dr. Naveen Prasad, who had worked with her twice before and who asked no questions beyond the ones he needed answered to do his job. She liked him for that. The scrub tech was a young man she'd never worked with, named Darius, who looked at her with barely concealed uncertainty for exactly the first 90 seconds, and then locked in when she asked for instruments with the ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. She had done it 1,000 times. Not here. Not in a room this clean. But the hands remembered what the resume didn't advertise. The splenic laceration was grade 4. Worse than she'd hoped. Better than she'd feared. She worked steadily, talking through each step under her breath, not for the room but for herself. The way she'd learned to do in places where there was no attending to check your work. At some point, she became aware that Whitaker had entered the observation gallery above. She didn't look up. She felt his presence the way you feel weather coming, something in the pressure of the air. She closed the spleen. Then she found the hepatic bleed, a small nick, easy to miss, the kind that killed people 3 days later when they were already supposed to be recovering. She repaired it without comment. Naveen gave her a look over his mask that meant, "Did you just find that?" She gave him a look back that meant, "Yes, keep going." 94 minutes after she'd first gloved up in the trauma bay, Bryce Hollander's blood pressure was 110/70 and climbing. She stepped back from the table. Darius was already counting instruments. "Good bleed check," she said. "Close him up." She stripped her gloves and walked out. Whitaker was waiting in the hallway. He had removed his jacket at some point. He was standing with his arms at his sides and his face arranged into something that was not quite an expression. The man in the dark suit was gone. The 2 uniformed officers were 20 feet away, giving him space. Peg was at the nurse's station pretending to chart. Mia walked past him toward the sink. "Dr. Sutton." She turned on the water. "You want to tell me," he said, "where a hospitalist learned to do what you just did in there?" No, she said, I don't. He was quiet for a moment. He's going to make it. Barring complications, yes, the hepatic repair. Naveen said you caught a bleed that wasn't on any of the imaging. It was there. He said surgeons miss those. She dried her hands. Some do. Whitaker looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was doing something complicated. She recognized it. It was the expression men made when they were renegotiating a position they'd committed to publicly and didn't want anyone to see the revision in progress. I owe you an apology, he said finally. Mia looked at him. Yes, she said. You do. He blinked. She suspected most people didn't respond that way. I was wrong to dismiss you, he said. I made an assumption based on how I look and what it says on my badge, she said, not unkindly. Just accurately. It's not the first time. It won't be the last. But yes, you were wrong. He absorbed this. You were in the service. She didn't answer. Medic? He asked. That kind of background. That background is mine, she said. Not relevant to your situation. He nodded slowly. He was reevaluating. She could see it happening in real time, the categories reshuffling. She almost felt sorry for him, almost. Is there anything you need? He asked. Anything I can, if there's something I can do. She considered this. Actually, she said, yes. She had come to Eastfield 3 years ago running from something she hadn't fully named yet. Her fellowship had been in trauma surgery at Walter Reed, the thing she'd been building toward, since she first watched a field surgeon save a man's life with instruments that had no business being used for surgery. She had wanted that. She had worked for it with the kind of single-mindedness that leaves marks. She'd been 8 months in when she'd reported what she saw. Her supervisor, Dr. Garrett Finch, decorated, published, broadly respected, had been falsifying outcomes data. Small adjustments at first, she thought. Then she dug deeper and understood it wasn't small at all. It was systematic, it was deliberate, and it had covered up at least 2 preventable deaths in his OR over 18 months. She'd gone through the right channels. She'd documented everything. She'd handed it to the department chief in a folder with her name on the front, because she wanted to be clear that she wasn't hiding. Dr. Finch had denied everything. The department had opened a review. And then, quietly, without announcement, the review had been closed, the findings sealed, and Mia had been told that her fellowship position was being restructured. The word restructured was doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. She'd appealed. The appeal had been denied. She'd contacted the Inspector General's office and submitted a formal complaint, and for 14 months nothing had happened while Finch continued to operate and she worked hospitalist shifts at Eastfield because it was the only position she could get, with a fellowship she hadn't officially completed, and a reference file she was not allowed to see. She knew what was in it. She could imagine it, precisely. She had stopped talking about it because talking about it hadn't helped, but she had not stopped waiting. What she asked Whitaker for was a phone call, not intervention, not influence. A phone call to someone at the Inspector General's office who would pick up when a 3-star general's name appeared on the screen and would stay on the line long enough to hear what she had to say. He looked at her for a long time after she said it. You have a complaint on file, he said. 14 months old. And I want it reviewed. By someone who doesn't work in the same building as the man I reported. That's all. He was quiet. She could see him calculating what this would cost him, whether she was credible, what it meant that a woman who had just performed an unrequested splenectomy and caught a hepatic nick that would have killed his man in 72 hours was standing in a hospital hallway asking for a phone call. What's the name on the complaint? He said. She told him. Something shifted in his face. It was subtle, a slight tightening around the eyes, a fractional change in posture. She filed it away. I know that name, Whitaker said. Most people in military medicine do. He has a strong reputation. I know. The kind of reputation that makes complaints disappear. I know that too. He looked at the floor, then he looked at her. I'll make the call, he said. Tonight. She nodded. For what it's worth, he said, what you did in there. I did my job, Mia said. The same job I'd have done for anyone on that table, rank or no rank. He held her gaze. She let him. I believe you, he said. Bryce Hollander woke up 2 days later. Mia was doing rounds when the ICU nurse flagged her down. He was asking for the doctor who'd operated. She almost said she wasn't a surgeon, which was technically true and also entirely beside the point. So she just walked down the hall and into the room. He was big even lying down. His voice was rough, still dry from the intubation. He looked at her with the careful eyes of someone who'd spent time in places where reading faces was a survival skill. "You're the one," he said. "I'm the one. Whitaker said you were internal medicine." "I am." He let that sit for a moment. Must have been a hell of a residency. She almost smiled. "I had a non-traditional background. Medic?" She looked at him. "Why does everyone ask that?" "Because of how you told him to step back," Hollander said. "I was in and out, but I heard that. Nobody talks to Whitaker like that unless they've been somewhere that taught them how." She was quiet. "Where?" he asked. She shook her head. "Get some rest, Sergeant Major. You saved my life. The team saved your life. I just found the problem." "That's usually the hard part," he said. She couldn't argue with that. The phone call Whitaker made went to a 2-star general at the Department of Defense, Inspector General's office named Adrian Coles, who had been in her position for 4 years and had a reputation for finishing things that other people left half done. General Coles pulled the file on the 3rd day. On the 5th day, she assigned an investigator. On the 9th day, the investigator found the 2nd file, the one that had been sealed after the first review, which had not actually been a review but a meeting between the department chief and Dr. Garrett Finch's attorney, the transcript of which still existed because transcripts of meetings usually do, regardless of whether anyone wants them to. The transcript showed, clearly and specifically, that the department chief had known about the outcome's falsification and had agreed to suppress the finding in exchange for Finch's agreement to name the hospital's simulation center after the chief's late wife. It showed also, and this was the part that made General Coles call Whitaker directly, that Mia's fellowship termination had not been a restructuring. It had been a coordinated response to her complaint, deliberate, documented, illegal. Mia found out on a Tuesday, between patients. She was reviewing a chest x-ray when Peg appeared in the doorway of the reading room and said, "There's someone here for you, conference room B." Peg's face was doing something unfamiliar. It took Mia a moment to identify it as Hope. The woman in conference room B was small, precise, and wore no visible rank, but carried herself like someone who didn't need it. She introduced herself as Agent Lorraine Mack, Inspector General's office. She had a folder. Mia sat down. "The investigation into your complaint has concluded," Agent Mack said. "I'm going to walk you through the findings, and then I'm going to tell you what happens next." What happened next, Mia learned in the following 40 minutes, was this. Dr. Garrett Finch had been suspended pending formal proceedings. The department chief had resigned. The outcomes data for every case Finch had been involved in over the previous 3 years was being reviewed by an independent panel. 2 families who had lost people had been contacted and were being offered full disclosure and support. Her complaint had been validated. The suppression had been documented. The termination had been found unlawful. "You're entitled to seek reinstatement of your fellowship," Agent Mack said, "or compensation in lieu of, or both. There are options, and you'll have counsel available." Mia looked at the table for a moment. "The 2 patients who died," she said. "Were their families told what happened?" "They're being told now." "Yes," she nodded. She had needed to know that first. Everything else was secondary to that. "Can I ask," Agent Mack said carefully, "why you didn't pursue this through other channels, legal channels? There were options outside the IG process." "I tried the IG process because I believed in it," Mia said. "I still believed in it after 14 months. I just needed someone to pick up the phone." Agent Mack looked at her for a moment. "General Whitaker speaks highly of you." "He doesn't know me." "He watched you work," she said. "That might be the same thing." She went back to the ICU that afternoon. Bryce Hollander was sitting up, attempting to negotiate with his nurse about the television remote. He stopped when Mia came in. The nurse took the opportunity to leave. "You look different," he said. "Same as yesterday." "No." He shook his head slowly. "Something's different." She sat in the chair by the window. Outside, the afternoon was gray and still, The parking lot full of ordinary cars belonging to ordinary people going through ordinary crises, the kind that didn't make the news and didn't require generals or investigators, but were just as real as any of it. They cleared my complaint, she said. 14 months, they cleared it. Hollander didn't say congratulations. He said, the right thing finally happened, and she appreciated that he understood the difference. Whitaker made the call, she said. He told me he was going to. She looked at him. He told you? Night before last. He came in and sat with me and told me what you'd asked for and what he'd done. Hollander paused. Whitaker's not a bad man. He's a man who's used to trusting what things look like. You didn't look like what he expected. Most people don't, she said, if you look closely enough. He was quiet for a moment. The monitor beeped steadily. Where'd you serve? He asked again gently. She looked at the window. Kandahar, mostly, she said. And one forward post I'm still not supposed to name. He nodded. He didn't press. People who'd been places understood the weight of names you didn't say. I came back and went to medical school because I wanted to do what the surgeons did, she said. The ones who showed up when things were already bad. I wanted to be ready. You were ready. I spent 3 years in a hospital waiting for someone to let me do the work I trained for, she said. That's the part no one thinks about, not just getting ready. Waiting to be let in. Hollander looked at her with the kind of steadiness that comes from having had a lot of time to look at things. You got in, he said. Just took a sergeant major almost bleeding out to get the door open. Efficient, she said. He laughed. A short, careful sound that was clearly painful and also clearly worth it. She stood up. You've got 2 more days in the ICU. Don't negotiate about the remote. Whatever you want to watch, they'll put it on if you ask. How do you know? Because Peg runs that floor, she said, and Peg will give you whatever you need as long as you ask instead of demand. She's been that way for 20 years. He considered this. Noted. Rest, she said. She walked out into the hallway, which was the same hallway it had always been. Same overhead lights, same floor, same smell of industrial cleaner, and something underneath it that was just the specific scent of human beings in the business of trying to hold things together. She had stood in this hallway 3 years ago for the first time, carrying boxes, feeling like she'd arrived somewhere temporary. A placeholder position, a waiting room. She stood in it now, and it felt for the first time like a place she'd earned. Whitaker came to find her on his way out of the building. She was at the nurse's station writing notes, the way she had been when all of this started, though it felt like much longer ago than 4 days. He stopped in front of the station. She looked up. He was in his dress uniforms again, jacket back on, every star in its place. He looked like what he was, a man who commanded things, who gave orders that moved people and resources across distances she couldn't imagine. He also looked, she thought, like someone who had recently recalibrated something. I spoke with General Coles, he said. She told me the finding. I know. I heard today. For what it's worth, he said. I should have made that call 14 months ago. Someone should have. But they didn't. No, he held her gaze. They didn't. She nodded once. She didn't say it was fine, because it hadn't been. She didn't say she understood, because she didn't need him to know whether she understood or not. She just accepted the fact of what he'd said and let it sit between them without needing to resolve it. Will you stay here? He asked. At Eastfield? I don't know yet. She hadn't thought about it. There was a fellowship to consider. Now that the path was open again, there were options she'd stopped letting herself imagine. I'll figure it out. If you decide you want a letter, he said, for anything, fellowship, position, whatever you're looking for, you have my number. She looked at him. A letter from a 3-star general, she said. For a doctor who caught a hepatic, bleed my team's best surgeon missed and kept a man alive who has been in this country's service since before you were finished with high school. He paused. I think that's a fair trade. She thought about her father, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee going cold. She thought about dust, and something she hadn't had a word for yet. She thought about all the ways she'd spent her adult life trying to be useful to people who'd been where he'd been, and all the years she'd spent being useful in rooms where no one knew it. Thank you, she said. He nodded. He put his cover on and walked toward the exit, his footsteps even on the floor. She watched him go. Then she turned back to her notes, picked up her pen, and went back to work, the same work she'd always done, in a building that felt, tonight, less like a waiting room and more like a place she'd finally fully arrived.